Michael had always been meticulous about his home, ever since he bought his modest suburban house 6 months ago. After years of renting, he finally had a place that was entirely his: a small yard, a creaking porch, and a front door that had seen better days. One Saturday morning, determined to improve security and give his home a fresh feel, he decided to change the old, worn-out door locks himself. It wasn't a complicated job. He had all the tools ready, the new deadbolt installed neatly beside the door. As he worked, the quiet of the neighborhood made the task almost meditative until he noticed a figure across the street. Karen, the self-appointed HOA president, stood on her front lawn, glaring at him as if he were committing a crime. Arms crossed tightly, lips pressed into a thin line, she didn't speak at first, just watched. Michael paused, giving her a friendly nod, but she waved him off dismissively. His heart sank slightly. He had expected a few curious glances from neighbors, but Karen's intensity was something else entirely. When she finally stomped over, heels clicking against the pavement, Michael realized that this wasn't casual nosiness. She was on a mission. "Why are you changing the locks?" she demanded, her voice sharp and condescending. "You need approval for that. You can't just do whatever you want in this neighborhood." Michael, keeping calm, explained that the locks were on his personal property, fully within his rights. He even offered to show her the purchase receipt and the home ownership papers. Karen waved him off, dismissing his proof as irrelevant. "I run this neighborhood," she said, a smug smile spreading across her face. "Everyone follows my rules." Michael felt a surge of disbelief. He had read HOA guidelines, and nowhere did it say she could dictate personal property changes, yet here she was, acting as if the entire community were her fiefdom. He tried to finish his work quickly, hoping she would go back to her own property. As he tightened the last screw on the deadbolt, he thought the ordeal was over. But he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. Karen had a reputation for escalating trivial matters, and he had inadvertently become her next target. Little did he know, she had already dialed 911, ready to paint him as a criminal simply for exercising his rights as a homeowner. That moment, simple and routine to Michael, was about to spiral into a confrontation that would draw the police, the community, and even the HOA's board into a tense and messy showdown. Michael had barely finished installing the last screw on his new deadbolt when the first distant wail of sirens cut through the quiet of the neighborhood. He froze, screwdriver still in hand, squinting down the street. Within seconds, 2 police cars rounded the corner, lights flashing and engines rumbling. The sudden arrival startled him. He had never called the police, and he had done nothing illegal. He stepped onto the porch, trying to make sense of the scene, when he noticed Karen standing in the middle of his driveway, gesturing wildly toward his front door. "She's calling the cops on me," Michael muttered under his breath, a mix of disbelief and irritation bubbling in his chest. Karen's face was a mask of righteous anger, and she immediately began explaining the situation to the arriving officers, using phrases like "suspicious man" and "he's tampering with the locks." Michael took a deep breath and stepped forward, keeping his hands visible. "Officers, I live here. I'm changing my own door locks. This is my property," he said calmly, though inside he felt his pulse spike. The first officer, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense expression, glanced at Karen and then back at Michael. "Do you have ID?" he asked, already sensing something was off. Michael handed over his driver's license and the property deed, and even showed the receipt for the new locks. The second officer, a younger woman, raised an eyebrow at Karen, who seemed increasingly flustered now that her story was being scrutinized. "Are you sure there's a problem here?" the younger officer asked softly. Karen huffed and repeated her claim that she runs this neighborhood and that homeowners are required to get approval for any changes. The words made Michael's jaw tighten, but he remained composed. After a tense few minutes, the senior officer addressed Karen firmly. "Ma'am, HOA rules do not give you law enforcement authority. Filing false reports is serious. You need to stand down." Karen's face flushed with anger, but the officers had made it clear, Michael had done nothing illegal. As the police left, Michael let out a long breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly ebb. Relief was mixed with disbelief. Someone could truly feel so entitled, so convinced that the rules of her little association gave her power over others' homes. Michael returned to the door, tightening the deadbolt once more and reflecting on the encounter. This small, simple act of replacing locks had already triggered a confrontation that involved police officers, accusations, and Karen's inflated sense of authority. It was a stark reminder that in this neighborhood, even ordinary actions could provoke extreme reactions. He knew one thing for sure: this was far from over, and Karen's obsession with control would likely escalate in ways he could not yet imagine. In the days following the police visit, Michael thought things might settle down. After all, he had done nothing wrong, and the officers had made it clear to Karen that her claims were baseless. But Karen was not a woman accustomed to losing. Almost immediately, subtle signs of retaliation began to appear. The first came in the form of HOA notices slipped under Michael's door. Each one was carefully worded to sound official, yet they were petty and trivial: a complaint about the unauthorized length of his lawn, another for improper placement of trash bins, and a final notice regarding his recent exterior home improvements, the very locks that had triggered the initial confrontation. Karen's persistence was relentless. She began posting passive-aggressive notes on his mailbox and in common areas, warning neighbors about community standards and subtly pointing at him as an example of a rule breaker. Some neighbors shook their heads sympathetically, while others avoided him, worried about drawing Karen's attention. Michael realized quickly that this wasn't just about locks, it was a battle for power and control. But rather than respond with anger, he took a different approach: documentation. Every notice, every note, every email from Karen was carefully photographed and catalogued. He even recorded interactions with her from a safe distance, ensuring he had evidence of her intimidation tactics. He attended the next HOA meeting, armed with copies of the bylaws and a calm, logical explanation of his rights as a homeowner. Karen, predictably, tried to dominate the discussion, interrupting him repeatedly and insisting that she set the rules for everyone. But the tide was beginning to turn. The other board members, initially hesitant to challenge her, started nodding along with Michael's points. They began to see a pattern of overreach and harassment. For the first time, Karen's authority seemed less absolute. Michael could sense her frustration building with each passing meeting, each piece of evidence he presented. The community, once intimidated, began quietly supporting him, offering subtle gestures of solidarity and sharing their own experiences with Karen's controlling behavior. Michael realized this was no longer just a personal fight, it was a fight for fairness, for accountability, and for the rights of every homeowner who had ever been cowed by her overbearing attitude. The confrontation had changed him. Michael felt stronger, more confident, and more prepared to defend his home against anyone who tried to overstep boundaries. And while Karen's retaliation had begun, it had also inadvertently set the stage for her eventual downfall. The seeds of her undoing were quietly taking root, nurtured by Michael's calm determination and the growing awareness of the neighbors around him. The week following the porch confrontation was unlike anything Linda Carter had experienced in years. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about the showdown with the HOA. Whispers of her son Michael's calm, commanding presence circulated from door to door, carried by neighbors who had long felt the heavy hand of Rick Dalton's leadership. Suddenly, Linda was no longer isolated, she had allies she didn't even know existed. It started subtly. A neighbor left a basket of fresh flowers on her doorstep. Another waved from across the street, a small nod of solidarity. By midweek, a few neighbors had gathered quietly in her yard, asking questions, sharing their own stories of intimidation and harassment. Linda felt a rush of warmth and relief. A community she thought long fractured was beginning to rebuild itself around her courage. The next HOA meeting became a pivotal moment. Linda, accompanied by Michael, entered the room with quiet confidence. Rick Dalton was already there, clipboard in hand, attempting to exude control. But the air was different. Faces that once bowed to his authority now held steady gazes, questioning his every word. Michael spoke first, his voice calm but piercing. He recounted the harassment, citing specific instances where Rick had exceeded his authority. He referenced neighborhood bylaws, clearly laying out violations in Rick's actions: fines issued without proper notice, inspections conducted without quorum, threats veiled as regulations. The room was silent, hanging on every word. One by one, neighbors began to speak up, corroborating Linda's story. "I've had similar threats," a woman admitted. "Rick fined me for leaving a trash can out for 5 minutes." Another man added, "I was intimidated for installing a small garden fountain." Each voice chipped away at the illusion of Rick's power, revealing the pattern of bullying that had gone unchecked for years. Rick's confidence faltered. He sputtered, tried to regain control, but the tide had shifted. The collective voices of the community, strengthened by Michael's steady presence and Linda's courage, made it impossible for him to dominate the room. Board members who had once silently complied now questioned his leadership, their expressions a mixture of shame and disbelief. By the end of the meeting, Rick's position was untenable. The board, under growing pressure, voted to implement new leadership procedures and review his actions. Linda watched quietly as justice began to take shape. For the first time, she didn't feel fear or anger, she felt relief, empowerment, and a renewed sense of belonging. Outside, the neighborhood seemed lighter. Flags flew on porches, children played freely, and neighbors exchanged smiles instead of wary glances. Linda realized that change didn't come from fear or intimidation. It came from standing firm, speaking truth, and letting others see your courage. Weeks after Karen's suspension, the neighborhood slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy. The tension that had once hung over the streets like a heavy fog had lifted, replaced by cautious optimism and relief. A special HOA election was held to select a new president, someone calm, fair, and genuinely committed to the community's well-being. The choice was a retired teacher named Linda, known for her level-headed approach and respect for residents' rights. Her election marked a new era for the neighborhood, one in which rules were enforced sensibly and harassment was no longer tolerated. Michael watched the changes unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Karen, stripped of authority and facing mounting criticism from the board and her neighbors, eventually moved away. Her departure was unceremonious, almost anticlimactic, but for Michael, it symbolized the triumph of reason and fairness over entitlement and intimidation. The house that had once been a site of tension and conflict now felt like a true sanctuary. For the first time in months, he could work on home projects, tend his garden, and enjoy quiet evenings on the porch without fear of unsolicited scrutiny. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance began to approach him, offering congratulations and sharing their own stories of Karen's overreach. Michael realized that his persistence hadn't just defended his own rights, it had inspired others to stand up for themselves and challenge the authority of someone who had long gone unchecked. The sense of community, strained for so long under Karen's domination, was beginning to rebuild, brick by brick, as people felt empowered to participate without fear. Reflecting on the ordeal, Michael understood that the battle over door locks had been about far more than mere hardware. It had been a fight for personal freedom, for dignity, and for the principle that no individual, no matter how vocal or aggressive, could override the rights of others. He had learned patience, strategy, and the importance of standing firm in the face of intimidation. As he installed a final security upgrade on his front door, a small, unobtrusive smart lock, Michael smiled. It was a simple act, yet deeply symbolic: his home, his rules, his life. The confrontation with Karen had tested him, but it had also strengthened him and the neighborhood. And now, with the streets peaceful once more and the community united, Michael knew that his home was truly, finally, his own.